the easiest way to hide the truth is to convince everyone it never existed. Professor Zyron Tal stood beneath a holographic projection nearly 40 feet wide. The image rotated slowly above the lecture hall, displaying artistic depictions of creatures most students believed belonged somewhere between mythology and fiction. The enormous auditorium of Galactic Academy was filled to capacity. Hundreds of students from dozens of worlds occupied tiered seating that curved around the central stage. Soft blue light reflected from polished metallic walls. Translation systems whispered in hundreds of languages simultaneously. It was one of the Academy's most popular lectures. History of Galactic Misconceptions. Professor Zyron enjoyed it immensely. For nearly 3 centuries, he announced, pacing beneath the projection, certain fringe researchers have insisted that humans once existed. A few students laughed. Others exchanged amused looks. The professor smiled. Unfortunately, the evidence remains non-existent. The hologram shifted. Ancient sketches, contradictory reports, fragmented records, none matched. Every description is different. Every account conflicts with the next. Some claim humans were unstoppable warriors. Others describe them as primitive farmers. Some reports place them near the galactic core. Others place them beyond mapped space. More laughter spread through the hall. In short, Zyron concluded, humans represent one of the greatest examples of mythological contamination in recorded history. Several students began taking notes. Others simply listened. The conclusion was not controversial. Most academic institutions taught the same thing. Humans belonged in the same category as countless legendary species that appeared in old stories and vanished under serious examination. Zyron raised one finger. Remember this. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The main doors opened. At first nobody noticed. The lecture continued uninterrupted. Then movement near the rear of the room gradually drew attention. Students began turning around. One row, then another. Conversations faded. The professor paused mid-sentence. Something unusual was happening. A young woman entered first. Lyriel Voss, one of the Academy's highest-ranked students. Blue-silver skin, golden hair. Academic distinction marks displayed prominently across her uniform. Normally she arrived early. Today she was late. Very late. The professor frowned. Then he noticed she was not alone. Someone followed her through the doorway. The stranger looked completely ordinary. White skin, dark hair, simple civilian clothing. No academy insignia. No academic credentials visible. No security escort. Nothing about him appeared remarkable. Yet the room had gone completely silent. The man glanced around the lecture hall with mild curiosity. Not nervousness. Not excitement. Curiosity. As though he had accidentally walked into the wrong building and was trying to figure out why everyone was staring. Professor Zyron folded his arms. Miss Voss. Lyriel stopped near the center aisle. Professor, you are interrupting a lecture. I know. The professor's gaze shifted toward the stranger. And who exactly is this? For a brief moment nobody moved. Hundreds of students watched. Waiting. Lyriel looked toward the man beside her. Then back toward the professor. This, she said calmly, is Ryan Walker. The silence deepened. The name meant nothing. Then Lyriel added 6 words. He is a human from Earth. Somewhere in the auditorium, someone dropped a data tablet. No one laughed. Professor Zyron Tal did not speak for several seconds. The silence spreading through the lecture hall felt heavier than any argument. Hundreds of students stared at the man standing beside Lyriel Voss. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others opened recording devices. A few simply looked confused. Ryan Walker seemed completely unaware that he had just become the most interesting thing in the room. He glanced around the auditorium, noticed the empty seat near the rear wall, and quietly started walking toward it. That simple action somehow made everything stranger. Professor Zyron finally found his voice. Miss Voss. Yes, Professor? Are you attempting to make a joke? No, a social experiment. No. Then perhaps you would care to explain why you interrupted my lecture with an impossible claim. Lyriel remained surprisingly calm. Because he asked if he could attend. Several students exchanged bewildered looks. The professor blinked twice. Attend? Yes. My lecture? Yes. Ryan reached the empty seat, sat down, and offered a small wave when he realized everyone was still staring at him. The gesture somehow made the situation even more absurd. Professor Zyron slowly turned toward the audience. Class. His voice carried the strained patience of someone desperately trying to maintain control. There are currently 2 possible explanations. He raised one finger. The first is that Miss Voss has somehow fabricated an extraordinarily convincing deception. A few nervous laughs appeared. Then he raised a second finger. The second explanation is that everything written about humans over the last 300 years is wrong. Nobody laughed at that one. The professor looked toward Ryan. Human. Ryan nodded politely. That is me. More silence. Zyron seemed irritated by how normal the response sounded. If you truly are human, then where exactly have you been hiding? Ryan considered the question. Mostly Earth. Several students immediately began taking notes. Others looked disappointed. One young alien raised a hand. Professor, that sounds like a real answer. Thank you, Ryan said. It was intended to be. The student stared, then looked even more confused than before. Zyron folded his arms. According to numerous accounts, humans are supposed to be extraordinarily aggressive. Ryan nodded. Sometimes. Exceptionally dangerous. Depends on the situation. Capable of surviving environments that would kill most species. That one is mostly true. Murmurs spread across the hall. Every answer created more questions instead of resolving them. Lyriel watched the reactions with growing amusement. This was exactly why she had brought him. Not because he would prove anything. Because reality was proving much harder to categorize than the legends. A student near the front raised 4 hands at once, a gesture apparently indicating urgency. Professor. What? He does not look mythical. Several students nodded in agreement. Ryan looked down at himself. I hope not. The student tilted his head. You look ordinary. Thank you. Another wave of confused whispers rolled through the room. Professor Zyron rubbed one temple. Decades of academic certainty were unraveling in ways he had never anticipated. Not because the human was proving the myths correct. Quite the opposite. Ryan Walker appeared stubbornly normal. No dramatic entrance. No supernatural abilities. No terrifying presence. Just a man sitting quietly in a classroom. And somehow that fact disturbed the professor more than any legend ever had. The lecture should have collapsed into chaos. Instead, something stranger happened. It continued. Professor Zyron Tal stared at the human for several long seconds before taking a slow breath and returning to the center of the stage. Years of academic discipline refused to surrender so easily. Very well, he said. Since we apparently have a representative of a fictional species in attendance, let us proceed. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the hall. Ryan smiled politely and settled deeper into his seat. He looked completely comfortable. That alone fascinated the students. Most visitors became intimidated by the scale of Galactic Academy. The auditorium seated nearly 1,200 students. Translation systems processed hundreds of languages simultaneously. Some professors held reputations that spanned entire sectors of space. Ryan appeared less concerned than someone waiting for a delayed train. Professor Zyron resumed the lecture. The holographic display above him shifted again, presenting historical records associated with human mythology. The most widely accepted theory, he explained, suggests humans emerged from exaggerated reports concerning multiple species later merged into a single legend. Ryan raised one hand. The professor froze. Yes. Sorry. Ryan lowered his hand slightly. Are questions allowed? Several students immediately activated recording devices. This was becoming far more interesting than the original lecture. Zyron folded his arms. Questions are the foundation of education. Great. Ryan nodded. Then I have one. The professor gestured impatiently. Proceed. Ryan looked up at the hologram. How did researchers determine those reports referred to different species? The professor blinked. Through comparative analysis. Of what? Historical records. Ryan nodded. Which records? Silence. Not because the professor lacked an answer. Because the question was unexpectedly specific. Zyron activated several displays and referenced archived sources. Ryan listened carefully. Around the room, students followed the exchange with growing interest. Lyriel watched from her seat near the front row. A small smile appeared on her face. She had seen this happen before. Ryan never argued aggressively. He simply asked questions until people began examining assumptions they had stopped noticing. Several minutes later, the professor completed his explanation. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. Okay. Zyron frowned. Okay. I think I understand. You disagree. Not necessarily. Ryan leaned back. I am just curious about something. The professor looked wary now. What? Ryan pointed toward a citation displayed above the stage. That source says humans were considered mythical because no verified sightings occurred during the last 300 years. Correct. How long ago was the source written? Zyron checked the date. Approximately 300 years ago. Ryan smiled. That seems inconvenient. A few students laughed. The professor did not. Ryan continued. If nobody had seen humans for 300 years when the report was written, and nobody has seen humans during the 300 years since then, does that not make the report 600 years out of date? The auditorium became very quiet. Several students immediately began reviewing the citation themselves. One raised 3 hands. Apparently that species equivalent of excitement. Professor, what? The human might have a point. More displays activated around the room. Data flowed through the air. Students examined sources that they had accepted for years without question. Lyriel noticed something remarkable. Ryan was not trying to prove humans existed. He was not defending his species. He seemed genuinely interested in how the Academy reached its conclusions. Professor Zyron remained silent for several seconds. Then he looked toward Ryan. You ask unusual questions. Ryan shrugged. Maybe. His gaze moved across the lecture hall. Or maybe everyone else stopped asking them a long time ago. Professor Zyron Tal disliked the direction of the conversation. He could feel it slipping away from him. Not because the human had presented extraordinary evidence. Ryan Walker had not presented any evidence at all. He had simply asked questions. The kind of questions that seemed harmless until people started thinking about them. Around the lecture hall, students were no longer focused on the professor's presentation. Hundreds of holographic notes floated above desks. Source records opened across personal displays. Citations that had gone unquestioned for generations were suddenly being examined in real time. Zyron cleared his throat. Class. The room gradually quieted. A flawed source does not invalidate a conclusion. Ryan nodded immediately. Absolutely. The professor seemed caught off guard by the agreement. It does not. No. Ryan leaned forward slightly. It just means we should make sure the conclusion came from the evidence and not the assumption. Several students immediately began recording that sentence. Lyriel noticed the professor's expression tighten. Not anger. Frustration. Ryan was refusing to behave like an opponent. Every time Zyron prepared for an argument, the human turned it into a discussion instead. The professor activated another display above the stage. Historical maps filled the air. Very well. Let us examine evidence. The maps rotated slowly. Ancient trade routes. Exploration records. Population surveys. Humanity supposedly occupied a significant region of space. Zyron pointed toward the projection. Yet modern surveys reveal nothing. Ryan studied the maps for several seconds. Then he raised one hand. Question. A few students laughed quietly. The professor sighed. Of course. Who performed the modern surveys? The Galactic Cartography Bureau. When Zyron checked the accompanying records. Approximately 140 years ago. Ryan nodded. And how much of the region was physically explored? Silence. The professor examined the data again. Students leaned forward. Several seconds passed. 23%, Zyron admitted. Ryan blinked. That seems low. A ripple moved through the auditorium. Not because 23% sounded unreasonable. Because nobody had noticed it before. The human was not uncovering hidden information. He was reading information everyone already had. Lyriel found that fascinating. Ryan continued. Do not get me wrong. 23% is a lot of space. He pointed toward the map. But it is also less than 1/4. Several students immediately started checking the survey methodology. Others reviewed exploration limitations. More questions appeared. More assumptions became visible. Professor Zyron folded his arms. You appear to believe uncertainty is proof. Ryan shook his head. Not at all. Then what do you believe? The human looked around the lecture hall. Hundreds of students waited for his answer. I think uncertainty is uncertainty. The room became very quiet. Ryan smiled slightly. That sounds obvious, but people forget it. He gestured toward the floating maps. If we do not know something, it is okay to say we do not know. Zyron stared at him. Academia requires conclusions. Sure. Ryan nodded. But conclusions and certainty are not the same thing. Lyriel watched the students carefully. Something had changed. When the lecture began, everyone wanted to know whether humans were real. Now a different question was spreading through the room. How many other things had they accepted simply because nobody had challenged them? And for the first time since entering the auditorium, Professor Zyron looked less like a lecturer and more like a man standing in front of a mirror he had never expected to see. By the time the lecture reached its second hour, nobody was paying attention to the original topic anymore. The holographic presentation still floated above the stage, displaying maps, historical records, and academic theories, but the atmosphere inside the auditorium had transformed completely. What began as a lesson about mythology had become something far more uncomfortable. Students were no longer asking whether humans existed. They were asking how many assumptions existed inside their own education. Professor Zyron Tal noticed it too. Every new question seemed to spread through the room like a ripple across water. A student from the outer colonies raised a hand. Professor, if the human is correct, should all historical conclusions be reevaluated? Another student immediately responded before Zyron could answer. That is not what he said. Then what did he say? He said uncertainty should remain uncertainty. Dozens of side discussions erupted simultaneously. Translation systems struggled to keep pace. Ryan sat quietly near the rear of the room, watching the debate unfold around him. He looked less like the center of a historic academic controversy and more like someone waiting for a delayed shuttle. Lyriel found that strangely amusing. Most beings placed in this situation would be eager to defend themselves. Ryan seemed more interested in listening than speaking. Eventually, Professor Zyron raised his voice. Class. The room gradually settled. Let us return to evidence. He turned toward Ryan. You have challenged assumptions. Some assumptions. Then perhaps you can offer an alternative explanation. Ryan considered that carefully. For what? For the absence of human civilization from modern records. Several students leaned forward. Finally, a direct challenge. Ryan thought for several moments. I do not know. The answer surprised everyone. Even Lyriel. Zyron blinked. You do not know? No, Ryan shrugged. I have theories. But theories are not evidence. Silence followed. Then something remarkable happened. Several students began nodding. Not because the answer solved anything. Because it sounded intellectually honest. Ryan continued. The problem is that everyone seems uncomfortable with not knowing. He gestured toward the historical maps floating above the stage. When information is missing, people naturally want a conclusion. Any conclusion. A student near the front raised two hands. Humans do that too? Ryan laughed softly. Humans especially do that. More laughter spread through the hall. The tension eased slightly. For the first time all afternoon, the students were not reacting to a myth or a legend. They were reacting to a person. Lyriel watched the shift happen in real time. Earlier they had expected a mythical creature, then a historical mystery. Now they were simply meeting someone. And somehow that seemed more powerful than either. Professor Zyron studied Ryan carefully. The professor had spent 30 years researching humanity as an academic phenomenon. Yet everything he had expected was wrong. The human was not intimidating, not mysterious, not larger than life. He was thoughtful, curious, occasionally funny. Most importantly, he seemed completely comfortable admitting what he did not know. That realization unsettled the professor more than any argument. Another student raised a hand. Ryan. The human looked up. Yeah. Are humans really as dangerous as the stories say? The auditorium became silent again. Hundreds of students waited for the answer. Ryan thought for a moment. Then he smiled. Sometimes. The students exchanged nervous looks. Ryan pointed toward the lecture hall. But usually we are dangerous to bad assumptions. For the first time that day, even Professor Zyron laughed. The lecture officially ended 32 minutes earlier. Nobody left. Students remained in their seats. Additional faculty members had quietly entered through side doors. Even the Academy's recording archives extended their storage allocation after detecting an unusual level of engagement. Professor Zyron Tal stood near the center of the stage watching something he had not witnessed in years. Genuine curiosity. Not curiosity directed toward a new discovery. Curiosity directed toward old assumptions. Ryan Walker still occupied the same seat near the rear of the auditorium. He had not moved much all afternoon. Somehow that made his presence more disruptive. Every mythological expectation the students carried about humans kept colliding with the ordinary reality sitting in front of them. A student from the xenobiology department raised a hand. Human Ryan. Just Ryan is fine. Why are humans absent from galactic records? Ryan smiled. That is actually a very good question. Do you know the answer? Not completely. The student looked disappointed. Ryan noticed immediately. That is not a bad thing. It is not. No. He leaned forward slightly. The most interesting questions usually survive because nobody knows the answer yet. Several students began recording that statement. Professor Zyron watched the reaction carefully. Something about the human's approach bothered him. Not because it was wrong, because it felt unfamiliar. Academia rewarded expertise, certainty, authority. Ryan seemed perfectly comfortable standing in front of 1,200 students and admitting uncertainty. Yet somehow that honesty increased his credibility instead of reducing it. Lyriel noticed the same thing. A few months earlier, she would have assumed confidence came from knowing everything. Ryan behaved as though confidence came from knowing the difference between facts and assumptions. Another student stood. This one belonged to a species famous for obsessive data collection. Human Ryan. Yeah. What is the most important lesson taught on Earth? The question triggered immediate interest throughout the hall. Even Professor Zyron looked curious. Ryan thought for several moments. Depends who you ask. Groans spread through the audience. Ryan laughed. Okay, fair. Let me try again. He looked around the room. Hundreds of alien students waited for his answer. Probably this. His expression became more thoughtful. Being wrong is not the same thing as failing. Silence followed. The statement seemed to surprise people. Ryan continued. If new evidence proves you wrong, that means you learned something. His gaze moved toward the holographic records floating above the stage. The problem is that a lot of people spend more energy defending old ideas than improving them. Nobody spoke. Not because they disagreed. Because every student in the room had seen examples. Some of them were thinking about their own professors. A few were thinking about themselves. Professor Zyron folded his arms. The comment was not directed at him specifically, yet it landed with uncomfortable accuracy. For the first time all afternoon, he found himself examining his own certainty, not his evidence. His certainty. The distinction suddenly mattered. Ryan looked toward the giant projection still hanging above the auditorium. Maps. Records. Historical theories. Centuries of accumulated scholarship. Then he smiled. Honestly, I think this class is kind of amazing. Several students blinked. Amazing, one repeated. Sure. Ryan nodded. You spent 300 years trying to figure out whether humans were real. A few laughs appeared. Humans spend most of our time trying to figure out ourselves. The laughter grew louder. Even Professor Zyron smiled despite himself. And somewhere beneath the humor, a realization quietly settled across the room. The greatest surprise about humanity was not that humans existed. It was that meeting one raised more questions than answering them. The discussion should have ended there. Classes had schedules. Professors had obligations. Students had assignments waiting across the academy. Yet nobody moved. The lecture hall remained full. Additional faculty members now occupied the rear observation levels. News of the humans' presence had spread through the campus faster than official announcements ever could. Ryan Walker seemed unaware of the attention. He sat quietly near the back row, sipping a cup of academy coffee someone had handed him 20 minutes earlier. His expression suggested he was still deciding whether he liked it. Professor Zyron Tal watched the scene with growing disbelief. For years he had imagined what would happen if humanity were ever proven real. He expected scientific upheaval, political consequences, historical revisions. He did not expect students laughing at jokes about uncertainty. A young student from the archaeology department suddenly stood. Professor. Zyron looked up. Yes. May I ask the human something? The professor hesitated, then sighed. Apparently everyone else has. Laughter spread through the room. The student turned toward Ryan. Human Ryan. Just Ryan. Right. Ryan. The student adjusted a translation device nervously. If humans are real, why did you disappear? The room became silent again. Ryan considered the question carefully. I do not actually know that we disappeared. Several students frowned. But you are here. Exactly. Ryan nodded. Which means at least some humans are still around. A few students exchanged glances. The answer sounded obvious. Yet none of them had framed the problem that way before. Ryan continued. The assumption seems to be that humans vanished. Did they not? Someone asked. Ryan smiled. Maybe. The room waited. Or maybe people stopped looking in the right places. Silence followed. Lyriel noticed Professor Zyron immediately open a historical map on his display. So did several faculty members. Ryan was doing it again, not presenting evidence, reframing the question. A professor from another department stepped forward from the observation level above. Human Ryan. Yeah. Are humans taught history differently? Ryan laughed softly. Very differently. How? Ryan leaned back in his seat. Most human historians start by assuming their information is incomplete. Several professors visibly reacted to that statement. The visitor frowned. That seems inefficient. Sometimes. Ryan nodded. But it also keeps you humble. The room grew thoughtful. Professor Zyron found himself staring at the human. Earlier that day, he viewed humanity as an academic curiosity, then as a challenge to accepted theory. Now something far more uncomfortable was happening. He was learning from him. The realization settled heavily in his thoughts. Around the lecture hall, hundreds of students continued discussing evidence, assumptions, and historical certainty. Yet Ryan never acted like the smartest person in the room. He simply kept asking questions that everyone else had forgotten to ask. Eventually, Lyriel noticed something unusual on the main display above the stage. During the discussion, students had been opening archive references faster than the system could organize them. Thousands of records now floated across the air. One citation suddenly appeared highlighted. Then another. Then several more. Professor Zyron frowned. That is strange. Ryan looked up. What is? The professor expanded the records. Ancient exploration logs appeared above the auditorium. Hundreds of years old. Forgotten. Ignored. Then the room became completely silent. Because for the first time that day, the evidence itself had started asking questions. Professor Zyron Tal expanded the highlighted records across the main display. The holographic projections grew until they filled nearly half the auditorium. Ancient exploration logs floated above the students like translucent sheets of light. At first glance, they appeared ordinary. Dates, coordinates, survey summaries. The kind of documents nobody noticed because thousands of similar reports existed throughout the Academy archives. Then the professor enlarged one particular entry. The room became silent. Ryan stood from his seat and moved closer to the stage. Not because he understood what everyone was seeing, because he wanted a better look. Lyriel followed. Hundreds of students leaned forward simultaneously. The highlighted report originated nearly 280 years earlier. It described a remote region of unexplored space beyond the outer survey boundaries. Most of the report concerned resource mapping and stellar navigation. Nothing remarkable. Then a single section caught everyone's attention. Contact avoided. Local inhabitants declined formal registration. Observation incomplete. Professor Zyron frowned. That cannot be right. More records appeared beside it. Similar wording. Similar locations. Similar outcomes. Dozens of entries. Then hundreds. Ryan stared at the pattern. Interesting. Interesting, the professor repeated. That is your response. Ryan pointed toward the records. Nobody forgot humans. The auditorium grew even quieter. What do you mean? Asked Lyriel. Ryan looked around the room. These reports are not saying humans disappeared. He gestured toward the archive entries. They are saying survey teams encountered populations that chose not to participate. Several students immediately reopened the source files. The wording remained exactly as Ryan described. Contact avoided. Registration declined. Observation incomplete. The phrases repeated again and again across centuries of exploration history. Professor Zyron felt something unpleasant settle into his thoughts. He had read many of these reports before. Everyone had. Yet nobody connected them. Because everyone already believed humans were a myth. The conclusion existed before the evidence was examined. A student from the Historical Sciences Department raised a trembling hand. Professor, yes. If these reports refer to humans. The student hesitated. Then humanity never vanished. Nobody answered. The implication hung over the room. Ryan walked closer to the projection. His eyes moved across the coordinates. The locations appeared scattered at first. Then he noticed something. Can you overlay a modern star map? Within seconds, the Academy systems complied. New projections appeared beside the old records. Gasps spread through the hall. The coordinates were not random. They formed a loose network extending through remote sectors rarely visited by major governments. Isolated. Independent. Quiet. Ryan smiled. That looks familiar. Professor Zyron looked toward him. You recognize it? Kind of. Ryan pointed toward the map. That is exactly where humans would go. Several students immediately began taking notes. Why? One asked. Ryan shrugged. Because every civilization has people who prefer being left alone. The simplicity of the answer struck the room harder than any revelation. For centuries, scholars searched for evidence explaining humanity's disappearance. Entire theories emerged. Endless debates followed. Yet the possibility that humans simply chose isolation had barely been considered. Not because evidence was missing, because the question itself was never asked. Lyriel stared at the glowing star map above the auditorium. The records had been available the entire time, stored inside public archives, indexed, searchable, forgotten, not hidden by conspiracy, hidden by assumption. Professor Zyron slowly lowered his hands. Around him, students continued examining the evidence. Yet for the first time all afternoon, he was no longer thinking about humans. He was thinking about certainty and how easily it could blind even the people who dedicated their lives to seeking the truth. The auditorium remained silent long after the final records finished loading. No one rushed to speak. No one hurried to defend a theory. Thousands of years of academic tradition had conditioned the students to search for answers. What they were experiencing now felt different. They were watching assumptions unravel in real time. Professor Zyron Tal stood beneath the floating star map, surrounded by evidence that had always existed, yet somehow remained unseen. The irony was impossible to ignore. The proof had never been hidden. It had simply been interpreted through the wrong lens. Slowly, the professor turned toward the audience. Hundreds of faces looked back at him, some confused, some excited, some thoughtful, all of them waiting. For the first time that day, he did not feel like a lecturer. He felt like a student. "Class," he said quietly. The room became even stiller. "For 30 years, I taught that humans were a myth." Nobody interrupted. I believe the conclusion was supported by evidence. His gaze drifted toward the ancient exploration records floating above the stage. "Today, I discovered something uncomfortable." Ryan remained seated near the rear of the room, listening without expression. Professor Zyron looked directly at him. The evidence was never the problem. Silence filled the hall. "My certainty was." The words settled heavily over the audience. Students exchanged glances. Faculty members lowered their displays. Even the automated recording systems seemed quieter somehow. Zyron took a slow breath. "Knowledge is valuable." He gestured toward the vast archive projections surrounding the stage. "Research is valuable. Expertise is valuable." Then his expression softened slightly. "But certainty can become a prison." No one laughed. No one moved. The statement carried too much weight. Lyriel Voss stood near the front row watching the professor carefully. Earlier that day, he had seemed immovable, a pillar of academic confidence. Now she was witnessing something rarer than expertise. Intellectual humility. Ryan finally stood and walked toward the stage. The students parted slightly to let him pass. He stopped beside the professor. "For what it is worth," he said, "I think your class was right about one thing." Zyron raised an eyebrow. "Only one." A few students smiled. Ryan pointed toward the ancient maps. "Humans do become myths sometimes." The professor looked confused. "How?" Ryan studied the star systems scattered across the projection. Anytime people stopped asking questions, the room grew thoughtful again, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Myths were not created by ignorance alone. Sometimes they were created when curiosity ended, when assumptions hardened into certainty, when questions became less important than conclusions. The academy bells sounded softly throughout the complex, signaling the end of the academic cycle. Students slowly began gathering their materials. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. They lingered in small groups discussing evidence, assumptions, and history. Not just human history, their own. Above the stage, the holographic records remained suspended in the air, unchanged. The information was exactly the same as it had been that morning. Only the perspective had changed. As the auditorium gradually emptied, Professor Zyron watched Ryan and Lyriel walking toward the exit together. The human had not proven humanity was special. He had done something more difficult. He had reminded an entire academy that the purpose of knowledge was not to eliminate questions. It was to ask better ones. And somewhere beyond the walls of Galactic Academy, among the distant stars where survey maps faded into uncertainty, humanity quietly continued existing. Not as a myth, not as a legend, just as people, which, Ryan suspected, was far more interesting.